Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show looking to swap out old baggage for brand new travel suitcases. I'm Christy Powell. My co-host tonight is well on her way to transatlantic sainthood. Welcome, Arden of Eden.
Hey, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
And our guest tonight is once again asking you to recover from religion. Welcome, RFR agent Kara Griffin.
Hi, thanks for having me. Glad to be here. And yes, please, let's all recover from that.
So tonight we're putting misogyny in our rear view mirror. So call the show at 512-991-9242 or tiny.cc/callsex because the show is starting right now.
All right, well, let's do it. Kara, tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe some of the chapter headings on your gender journey, if you would.
Oh, yeah, sure. So I identify as non-binary, which you probably knew given the title of the show. But it's interesting that you ask that, about a gender journey, because to me, that hasn't really been the journey. I've always been this way, but we didn't necessarily have this term for it. But I would say the journey has been more a matter of getting past the expectations and terminology and really false ideas that people put onto you about gender that don't necessarily account for a non-binary option. So that's really been the journey. I guess, let's see, chapter headings. Ooh, there's if we named them like, Friends episodes, the one where I told my mom I'm not a girl when I was 5, that didn't go over well. And I grew up in really fundamentalist Christianity. So, gender, options were not there. It was very much, there's God made men and women, in the story with the magical fruit and the talking snake, we learned that there are only 2 genders and therefore that's all there is to work with. So that was exciting. Let's see, more chapter headings. You want me to just keep going? You want my whole life story?
Yeah, I mean, if you would, I guess I want to really highlight something you already brought up, which is that you didn't become non-binary, nor did you choose to become non-binary. I feel like that is such a common misconception here. You simply were non-binary, and then at a certain point in time, you started to recognize that and realize that. I guess I'm curious about that process, though.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, I think a lot of the kind of rhetoric around that, especially in kind of the evangelical Christian community where I grew up, is this idea that, people that don't fit the gender roles that we've prescribed for them are confused about their gender. They don't understand themselves. No, that's not it. We're not confused. Well, I mean, I can't speak for other people. I can only speak for me. I was never confused about my gender. I was confused about some of the strange things people were telling me about how gender was supposed to be that did not match me.
Sure.
That was the confusing part. But yeah, like I said, I mean, ever since I was, very young, I remember, realizing that I didn't really fit what the expectation was for girls. Obviously, I was, raised female. And it was a constant struggle that, you're not being ladylike enough. You're not honoring God with your body the way that you're supposed to do, with your dress and the way you sit and speak and act and think and feel. And, everything that you do in your life has to, conform to this, very rigid gender binary that just, it wasn't me. It's not like I was trying to be difficult. That just wasn't me. And I think, kind of like you said, people kind of have this idea that, well, you're just trying to be provocative or whatever. No, I'm not. This is really how I am. And it's just not accounted for in this, very binary thought process where, you have this, they always refer back to this Bible verse, in Genesis, well, God created them male and female, and, they're very different, and then, proceeds to lay out their roles. The men will work the field and the women will, have excruciating childbirth, and that's your lot in life. And, you must now follow all of the rest of these, very strict performances. And it just did not sit well with me. And we didn't have the term non-binary, though, when I was a kid. That was, I don't know, I think that, didn't that term come out? I think y'all said in 2013 or something like that in one of the previous episodes.
Yeah. We talked to Diana Anderson about that, and even I was a little shocked to recognize just how new that specific term was. I mean, certainly the notion of folks who are agender or gender queer or are somewhere on the gender spectrum outside of those two binary points. That's not a new thing by any stretch of the imagination, but it's amazing to see how quickly the language has taken on, and now that this now that this label exists, people are flocking to it in really fascinating ways.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, because that really shows that there was a need for that terminology to be there. There are so many people like myself. I think when I found out about that term, immediately I was like, oh yeah, that's it. There I am. I'm not broken. I'm non-binary. Because what they tell you, depending on what you grow up in. I'm obviously talking about evangelical Christianity in the United States. It's different in other places and other belief systems, but what they tell you and what I grew up in is you're doing it wrong, you're sinning, you're being perverted in some way, you're
just doing a really
God.
shitty job at being a good godly woman.
Yeah, exactly that. Yes. Which, and I actually internalized that as well for a while. I guess that's how I am. I guess I'm a shitty woman. I mean, they tell you that enough times and you realize, well, I sure don't match, what I'm supposed to be doing and thinking and feeling. So I guess that's my fault. But, in fact, it's poor terminology among some other problems. So yeah, I think having that label, is really helpful, probably for younger people too, who can grow up already with that, being in the common vocabulary and recognize themselves sooner. I think that's really great for them, because I know as soon as I found out about it, I was like, yeah, perfect. Okay, great. Glad we have that now.
Yeah, there's a word for it. Like, thanks. Yeah, that's settled. No, I'm fascinated by the way that the younger generations have picked up on these ideas. Like whenever as a therapist, I will often have some very anxious parents that come to me and are like, we want to support our child, but we're not sure what's going on. And whenever I sit down with a 12 or 14 or 16-year-old, like, they seem to know what's up. They're still developing their identity the way all 12 and 14 and 16-year-olds ought to be, but they seem to be ready to roll with some of this language.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I was just talking to a friend of mine recently who's a school teacher, and she was basically saying the same thing. She was telling me one of the teachers at their school had transitioned from male to female over the course of the school year, and she had just, kind of not really finished her transition, but is, presenting, as female and using she, her pronouns and everything like that now. And my friend was telling me about, I was wondering if the students were going to be really shocked by that or be mean to her. And I started asking around about it, and they're just not even fazed by it. The kids are just like, yeah, obviously she's a lady now. What are you asking me this for?
It's almost as if transphobia was not like an integral part of our human biology and maybe a cultural thing. I don't know. I don't know.
Nonsense.
Yeah. What is some of the cultural baggage or some of these beliefs or assumptions that kind of stood in the way as you were, I guess, coming to these ideas or maybe coming to this understanding of yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot. I think, I mentioned a little bit about, obviously the religious ideology is, as far as I can see it, the biggest, quote unquote, stumbling block, which is an ironic term given that, that's usually what, women are referred to in evangelical Christianity.
Oh, sure.
You are a stumbling block. You're a threat to men by existing in a female body, which is great fun when you actually, don't necessarily want to be developing into that body in the first place. But that's obviously a big issue for me. But also, I think something that came out of that as well, that, I can't completely blame, Christianity for, but just, sort of the cultural milieu in general is something I realized, fairly recently, is that I had ended up developing some, I guess you could call it internalized misogyny during this time. Of course, I consider myself a feminist, but growing up in this sort of way of thinking where there's two options, there's men and women are clearly valued lower than men in many ways, and being that I didn't really fully identify as female and was continuously being pushed to do so, obviously I was very resistant to that. And it almost developed this sort of mindset of, well, everything that's feminine is bad and I hate it. And I want to get as far away from it as I can. And people that are, very, very feminine, are just off-putting to me in some way. I had kind of developed this way of thinking, not really intentionally, almost to where I was participating in misogyny in some ways by putting down anything that would be considered feminine, like, oh, you like things that are pink and frilly, how disgusting, you're a weak person, or, whatever the case may be. And it wasn't really until I read this great book by Bell Hooks, which I recommend to everyone, called Feminism is for Everybody. Go out and read that. And she kind of discusses this in that book, that it's something that, we start trying to do almost, to defend ourselves. If you're in a female body and experiencing sexism, you might try to distance yourself from that. But femininity isn't the enemy of gender equality. Misogyny is. And we kind of forget about that sometimes. And so I had to actually kind of work through that myself and realize, I need to be supporting women and non-binary and trans people, not trying so hard to put women down or put down things that are feminine just because it does not describe me. There's nothing wrong with it. Obviously, it's great. Some people, really enjoy, expressing their femininity or their masculinity, and that's fine if you're not hurting someone. And so I had to kind of do the work of realizing, okay, just because I don't fit into either of these categories doesn't mean that other people don't really enjoy them and can't really, thrive in them. So that was definitely something I had to work through.
Yeah, I mean, when there's so much like cultural pressure to be one thing or the other, people are going to react and respond to that pressure. It's not at all shocking to me that folks often think like, children are just confused. Well, yeah, because we're creating this very confusing world where we're saying all this very contradictory stuff and believing that these things are like integral to our nature as humans, or at least this gender binary is, when in reality, that's a cultural construct and something that isn't even the same from culture to culture, let alone looking historically.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And, as soon as you start reading books or traveling or anything like that, you start to realize, oh, this is different everywhere. These things that they told me were naturally the way that men and women were are obviously not at all. It's incredible that people can even maintain this notion that, oh, there's all these, biological differences. Now, that's not to say that people are not biologically different in many ways, but to think that gender is something that is, born out of your biology, and that is the way that we need to organize people in the world and determine what their relationships will be and what their job will be and what their clothing will be and how they will speak and comport themselves. I mean, it's just outrageous. It's not natural at all.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the opportunity to kind of highlight this cultural aspect of everything. Before the show, you expressed to me that you largely came out while you were living abroad. And so I'm really curious what that experience looked like and how it was maybe different than when you were here in the States.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I was living in Japan for a while. And that was kind of when I started, kind of trying on this label. I kind of had looked into it a little bit more and heard about, oh, non-binary, that sounds like me. And started I had been thinking about that for a couple of years, actually, and thinking, yeah, that's me. I'm obviously that. But as far as making that something that I said publicly to other people or expressed publicly, I think it was actually really helpful to be someplace other than at home when I was doing that, because it's a little bit of, I hate the term safe space, but it is a space that feels safer when you're someplace else where you can try something out, and if it doesn't work out or it's awkward or something embarrassing happens or someone really reacts badly, you're probably never going to see those people again. So the stakes are a little bit lower if you have a chance to try these things out, not in your home living with your parents or something like that, So it actually was really a good experience for me. Also, I was living in Tokyo, which has a pretty vibrant LGBTQ plus community, which is interesting because, I don't know how much you know about Japan, but as far as, LGBTQ rights and things like that, gay marriage is still not legal. Things are pretty strict about stuff like that. But something that's different than the US is there's not so much this idea of like this stigma of you're being evil and sinful if you're doing something that's sexually different or gender-wise different. It may be frowned upon, or certain things may be legal or illegal, but there's not this additional undercurrent of, and you're a pervert and you're going to hell, which, it's nice to not have that part.
Yeah. Were there any other philosophies or maybe just beliefs about gender that kind of stand out from your time abroad?
Yeah, I think kind of like I started to mention earlier, one of the nice things about traveling really anywhere is that you get to see that a lot of things that you took for granted, just, as part of the way things are, those aren't the way things are. Those are the way things are where you live, but they're not just naturally the way people are. Like even just ideas of, what's masculine and what's feminine. Obviously, we know that's very different across the world. There's nothing, biological about blue being for boys and pink for girls. But like even in Japan, where, sexism is definitely a thing. They're not immune to that either. But the way that masculinity and femininity are expressed, it's just not exactly the same. For example, I feel like in the US, a lot of times, and again, I'm really overgeneralizing here. Obviously, everyone is different, but that kind of like toxic masculinity, bro culture, go get jacked at the gym, and that's not a thing so much in Japan. There's not a bunch of jacked bros going around, performing masculinity in quite that way. It's perfectly normal for businessmen to be walking around with what looked to me like what we would consider a lady's handbag. It's just the style of dress and the way people carry themselves and types of things like that are really minor. It just kind of highlights the fact that so many parts of our everyday life that we associate with masculine or feminine are just completely arbitrary and made up. And that's not to say that there aren't certain conventions that go with masculinity and femininity there. They're just a little bit different than the ones here. And when you travel around and you see that over and over again, like, oh, here it's here in this place in a slightly different flavor. And then here it is over here, a little bit different flavor here. It just really drives home the point that this is something that we as a society kind of decide upon. And we do these conventions, and there's nothing set in stone about it, and we can decide something different if we want to, and we can decide to include more people if we want to. So that was, I think that's one of the main benefits of traveling, just for anyone, is getting to see things like that and rethink, what you thought about that were, natural or normal, and realizing, oh no, some of that is not.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. I think you draw a great point that like really goes far for like, as far as like recovering from religion and some of the work you do of like how just getting outside of when you grow up in a certain environment, it's really easy, like you were saying, to be convinced that that's really all there is. And that is innately how people are. And it's just so not the case. And I think it can go leagues for healing you just to see how other people can be. To know that, oh, I don't have to be that way. I'm not broken. Like I think that's like a beautiful lesson to draw from those experiences.
Yeah, the genders are all made up and the points don't matter. So like if you notice that we are doing it differently from place to place, then yeah, we get to kind of pick and choose a little bit and recognize that these things aren't immutable, and they're not magic. They're not perfect. They're just descriptors. They're just adjectives and ways of trying to understand the different ways that people exist.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so helpful too, especially if you've grown up in an environment where, like you were saying, Arden, where, that it's not just assumed, but it's explicitly taught to you that this is natural, this is the only way to be, and it's the only way it has been. This is how men and women have been since God created them this way 6,000 years ago, and you can't deviate from that.
Totally.
Oh, so
Then you
many
come to
wrong
find
things
out-
in one sentence. It gives me shivers.
Yes, exactly. It's kind of astounding. And you go try. Oh, it was funny too. When I was in Japan, I was taking a language class, and one of the teachers at the language school found out I was from Texas and stopped the class to ask me. She's like, "Is it true that in the southern United States there's a museum where they have this Noah's Ark thing, and they have a museum about the Earth being 6,000 years old? That's not real, is it?" And I'm like, "I'm sorry, yes, that is a real thing."
Museum is kind of a strong word.
Yeah. Yeah, I said, I don't use the word museum, but they do call themselves that. And her brain exploded. She was just like, "But why would they do that?" I don't know. It's hard to say.
Well, I have about 10 dozen more questions about different genders around the world and just what that experience must have been like. But man, Arden, the calls are really actually stacking up at this stage.